Tensions continue to run high in Indian-controlled Kashmir. There has been no let-up in protests and clashes that have rocked this disputed territory for the last 70 days. Dozens have been killed over the past 2 months, and hospitals are facing difficulty to cope with the rising number of injured persons brought to the health facilities. Pro-independence groups have extended a shutdown call till September 22nd. Based on the fresh protest program, freedom marches will be held on Saturday, Sunday and Monday. On Tuesday, women have been asked to hold protest marches.
The entire valley has been turned into a military garrison. The entire leadership is either in jails or under house detention. But I want to make it clear that no level of force can break our resolve this time. And we won't rest until the issue is resolved based on the wishes of Kashmiris.
Government forces, including army soldiers, were heavily deployed across the region to prevent the scheduled march to central Kashmir's Budgam district on Saturday. Authorities had launched a crackdown on pro-independence activists to foil the march. Police have also arrested the region's noted human rights activist, Khurram Parvez. Despite the clampdown, a large number of people poured onto the streets and tried to march towards Budgam. Indian forces resorted to tear gas to disperse the people. This led to fierce clashes between protesters and government forces in several places. Meanwhile, the state government has come under scathing criticism for failing to address the situation. Founding member of Kashmir's ruling People's Democratic Party and member of Indian Parliament from Central Kashmir has resigned both from the party and the Parliament, saying the Indian government is treating people, quote, worse than Nazi forces.
Taking a call of my conscience and as a mark of protest on moral grounds against the brutal policies of BJP at centre and state government's complete sellout and surrender before them, I have decided to disassociate myself from the primary membership of People's Democratic Party and from the membership of Parliament.
Meanwhile, Pakistan's Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif has visited Pakistani-controlled Kashmir and said that he would raise the Kashmir issue in his address to the UN General Assembly on September 21st. Kashmir's pro-independence leaders here have welcomed Sharif's move and also the initiative of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to send an international mission to Kashmir to probe the rights violations and indiscriminate use of force against the civilians. Sayyidi Safi reporting for Press TV, Indian-controlled Kashmir.
The U.S. military is saying one of its coalition airstrikes aimed at ISIS may have unintentionally struck Syrian forces. It happened in the eastern part of the country on the 5th day of a fragile ceasefire. The Associated Press is reporting that Russia claims at least 62 Syrian soldiers are dead. The U.S.-led coalition is now calling off its air campaign against the Islamic State terrorists in that area. Aaron David Miller is a former advisor to 6 secretaries of state and VP of the Woodrow Wilson Center. He joins us now to weigh in on this issue. Aaron, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.
You know, from the onset, there was doubt that this fragile cessation of violence in Syria could be achieved. And now, less than a week old, it appears the ceasefire is in jeopardy. Why?
Too many moving parts, too many different agendas, external powers, specifically the U.S. and Russia, that may have a tactical coincidence of interest, but whose strategic goals with respect to Syria are fundamentally different. And the reality is that the actors on the ground are going to control the ceasefire. It's arguable, frankly, whether Assad can control his own militias. You've seen the difficulties in separating out the so-called moderate Syrian, carefully vetted opposition elements from those of Nusra and the Islamic State. And just in general, after 5 years of bloody civil war, hemorrhaging terrorists and refugees, you have a fundamentally unsettled situation on the ground. And you saw it today, if the reports are true, that the United States unintentionally struck Syrian military positions near Deir el-Zor alongside an effort to strike the Islamic State. All this is going to do is make the situation on the ground much more complicated. It's going to confirm conspiracy theories that we really are supporting the Islamic State and backing the Iranians against the Shia.
Aaron, I mean, you really
against
put out a
Assad.
mouthful there, because when you look at that, all of the forces on the ground there are in such close proximity to each other. So that was always one of the concerns when Russia involved itself into this Syrian conflict. And now you have Russia and the United States both pointing the finger at each other for various violations of this agreement, and more importantly, valuable humanitarian aid that was designed to get to those Syrian people caught in the crossfire of this civil war. Well, it has not been met. It's not been delivered due to rebel factions in Aleppo, and so now Russia accuses the U.S. of not being able to control opposition rebels. How can the U.S. resolve this conflict or this issue in order to keep this fragile ceasefire secure?
I mean, I'm not sure they can, and I think we have to stop thinking about comprehensive solutions and get used to the reality that you're going to be dealing with very uncertain outcomes. Look, for the next 3 or 4 months, Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin actually have a coincident sort of overlapping goal, which may, in fact, suggest that this thing can be put back together. Obama wants to leave office with the situation in Syria a little more stable and preempts criticism that he has been too passive in the face of a 5-year struggle. Putin wants to use the U.S. in order to secure and legitimize Russian interests there. Both of these actors fundamentally believe that there is no overarching comprehensive deal in Syria. And I suspect it's going to be left to the next he or she, R or D, to deal with Syria as well as the other headaches.
All right, well said,
that
and I'm not trying to interrupt you,
region.
Aaron, but I want to get to another question real quick, because we're going to lose you in a matter of time. A more intense focus will be on Syria when the United Nations 71st General Assembly convenes next week. Will the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the heads of state like President Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin be able to, and obviously you're saying that it's probably not likely, but will they be able to secure some sort of diplomatic and peaceful end to meet the humanitarian need that exists because of the Syrian conflict?
Highly unlikely in the next week or so. Really highly unlikely. 3 powers control the situation on the ground in Syria right now: Russia, Iran, and Turkey.
Wow.
And that reality, because of demography and geography, will probably remain the case and dictate the situation over the course of the next year.
And what does that mean for the millions of people who have been displaced, who have already fled? They're now in a refugee status. You even have the Pope coming out saying the world needs to open up its arms to refugees. But you know, with that goes the concern about each country's national security because of trying to vet those refugees who are fleeing what's unfolding in Syria.
Moral, humanitarian, and strategic tragedy and disaster for the United States. Largest single refugee flow since the end of the Second World War. But let's be clear about something. The U.S. record on humanitarian interventions, from the Holocaust to Rwanda to Darfur to Congo, with the exception of Bosnia, is pretty poor. This is not just a Barack Obama problem. This is a problem that the United States has confronted for the last 50 to 60 years, trying to figure out how to deal with these humanitarian catastrophes when their interests were involved, our interests were involved, and even when they're not. And frankly, given our track record among Republicans and Democrats, we still haven't found the right prescription to deal with internal events like Syria.
Aaron David Miller, thank you for your insights and your perspective, sir. Good day to you.
Always a pleasure.
An anti-police note was found at the scene of a shooting rampage in Philadelphia that left 1 woman dead and 5 others injured, including 2 police officers. Authorities say 25-year-old Nicholas Glenn walked up to a patrol car and started shooting the female officer inside. Officers nearby heard the shots and chased the suspect, who shot a security guard at a bar, then used a woman as a human shield before shooting her. He then fired into a car, killing a woman inside and critically injuring a man. Before police shot him dead in an alley, police believe Glenn acted alone.
2 police officers in Texas recovering after being shot by an unidentified gunman. The officers were responding to a call about a possible suicide at a home in Fort Worth. When they arrived, well, they were told a witness was in an outdoor shed, and then they were shot when they were opening the door to the shed. Can you believe this? Police returning fire, killing the gunman. Both officers luckily expected to be okay.
The outpouring in the community already is amazing, and that's exactly what these fine men and women need. But I want you to know, as citizens of our community, that our officers are well trained and well protected.
One of the officers only had minor injuries, thanks in part to protective body.
A near tragedy in New Jersey. An explosive device detonates at the site where a charity race was about to begin. It is our top story. Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Antoine Lewis. Christina Park is off tonight. Now, a press conference just wrapped up that provided very little details about the blast. What we do know is that no one was injured when the pipe bomb-like device exploded inside a trash can in Seaside Park. And authorities say this was not a prank. Dan Bowens is live tonight in Seaside Park with what the police had to say on this case. Good evening.
Started as a relatively normal day here in Seaside Park. It's a Jersey Shore community about a 2-hour drive from New York City. Nowhere this explosion happened, and neighbors say it sounded like.
This morning, there was scheduled to be a Marine Corps Simplified Marathon, or 5K run, scheduled to take place at approximately 9 a.m. this morning. Due to a subsequent delay, the race was not able to start at 9 o'clock. At about 9:30 this morning, an explosion had occurred in a trash can along the raceway.
I just heard from the sheriff's office that a bomb went off at the end of our street.
That's when we saw the garbage can. I mean, it just happened. It was still smoldering, and there was a police officer there, and he's like, people stand back. So then we continued to walk down the boardwalk and then ran into somebody else, part of the race, and said that there was a bomb that went off.
This is a Semper Fi race, and those young Marines would have been leading from the front and again finding themselves in harm's way.
Yeah, once again, we experienced some technical difficulties with Dan's shot, but the bomb-like device exploded at near the beginning of the race, and again, the event was all to support the military. We'll check in with Dan a little bit later in our newscast.
Saturday morning, as about 5,000 people were set to run a 5K Marine charity race, and police are investigating another suspicious package in the shore town. Authorities said a device exploded in Seaside Park, New Jersey. Police said the explosive device went off in a garbage can on D Street at about 9:30 a.m. According to the Ocean County Prosecutor's Office, no one was injured in the blast. The third annual Marine Semper Fi 5K race to benefit the MARSOC Foundation was expected to start at about 9 a.m. Authorities said it was delayed because of late sign-ins.
We're going to start here this morning on a much more serious note. ABC News got an exclusive in a high-profile murder case.
We've obtained never-before-seen police video showing an undercover officer posing as the brother of an alleged hitman, all in order to get information about the murder of a popular FSU professor. The state attorney telling ABC overnight the investigation's ongoing. They will, quote, continue until all avenues are exhausted and all those involved are held responsible. ABC's Matt Gutman has more on the latest twist in the search for evidence.
This morning, the revealing police interviews.
It was always this joke. He said, I looked into hiring a hitman and it was cheaper to get you this TV.
And the family suspected in a murder-for-hire assassination. In July 2014, somebody shoots famed FSU law prof Dan Markell.
He's inside, the car is running, and he's got blood all over his head. He's not responding to me.
Police didn't have much to go on, but they did have that one lead, which came from the neighbor who called 911. He said that he saw a light-colored car that looked like a Prius back out of this driveway and head down the street. Investigators call in his ex-wife, Wendy Adelson. They'd had a War of the Roses-type divorce. 10 months after the murder, police get a bead on that hybrid. Police charged two Miami felons, Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia, with Markell's murder. But who put them up to it?
I think I could just say I would be investigating Charlie Adelson.
Charlie is Wendy's big brother, so law enforcement sets up a sting against Wendy's family, finding her mother in Miami. The burly man posing as the brother of one of the alleged hitmen.
He's going through some rough times, and we want to make sure that you take care of what he's going through.
He has the paper, they're walking away.
The Adelsons never pay the money, but police say the sting sets off phone calls and conversations, including one in which Charlie, police say, allegedly tells a girlfriend they should make the mysterious messenger disappear. You better kill him because he's going to be a big problem. If you can't do it, I'll have someone else do it.
The working theory of the case is that the reason for this homicide was due to the bitter divorce that was ongoing.
But prosecutors so far still don't have enough evidence to indict any of the Adelsons. Lawyers for Charlie and his parents say police accusations are fanciful fiction. For Good Morning America, Matt Gutman, ABC News, Tallahassee.
A very layered story. Thanks to Matt. So we want to bring in ABC's senior legal correspondent, Sunny Hostin. Sunny, thanks for joining us. As we said, this is very layered. So the police have recommended charges against Charlie Adelson, who was the brother, and his former girlfriend. He even said, Charlie, the police say, he allegedly tells a girlfriend, as you heard in that piece, that you better kill him, should make that mysterious messenger disappear. So they have this, but the state attorney is declining to press charges. Why?
So far, that's right, because there's a different standard. The police don't have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. That's a very, very high standard. The police standard is only probable cause. And so I suspect that the prosecution is still investigating this case. They have a lot, but they don't have enough to go forward. Let's remember, this is a murder charge. Very, very difficult to prove without eyewitnesses, without DNA, without a smoking gun.
We have had some arrests and some charges brought. Do you suspect there are things going on behind the scenes that we can't see?
Absolutely, Dan. When I was prosecuting cases, we would get questions from the media all the time, questions from the family members all the time. You really can't tip your hand when you're in the middle of a murder investigation. I really suspect that we're going to be hearing much more from this case going forward.
Sunny Hostin, great to have your analysis on a Saturday morning.
It's my pleasure.
A grim milestone for the Windy City, with the Chicago Tribune reporting this week that more than 3,000 people have been shot since the beginning of the year. That's an average of one shooting victim every 2 hours in the city, where 8 people were killed and 35 wounded last weekend alone. My next guest says Chicago is the country's most glaring example of the Ferguson effect. Heather McDonald is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of the book, The War on Cops, How the New Attack on Law and Order Makes Everyone Less Safe. So welcome back, Heather.
Thank you, Paul.
All right, so what is going on in Chicago that is behind this surge in violence?
The police are backing off, and criminals have become emboldened. Chicago demonstrates what happens when cops, under this false narrative that they're racist for trying to maintain order in high crime areas, decide not to engage in what President Obama calls racist policing. They're driving by people on known drug corners who are hitching up their waistband at 1 a.m. like they have a gun, and not getting out of their cars, because when they do get out of their cars, they're routinely surrounded now by hostile, jeering crowds, cursing at them, sometimes throwing things at them. And besides that street-level animosity, they're operating under this pervasive narrative that has been promulgated by President Obama, echoed by the media, and of course put out there constantly by the Black Lives Matter activists, that the police are engaged in some homicidal shooting spree against blacks, all of which is patently, grotesquely false, Paul.
All right, you've been spending time in Chicago with police. You've talked to Dean Angelo, who's head of the police union. You wrote a piece for us this week. What else, other than sort of driving by people on corners, what else are the police not doing? Are they just sort of backing away from any kind of policing in these high-crime neighborhoods?
Oh, certainly not. The police are answering 911 calls after there's been a victim with alacrity.
Okay.
They're trying to solve murders. They're trying to solve homicides. Of course, with the no-snitch ethic, people are not cooperating with them. But what they're not doing, Paul, is that vast area of purely discretionary policing, of public order enforcement, what's known informally as clearing the corners. If there's large groups of teens hanging out, loitering, the public, the law-abiding residents want the police to intervene, but the activists and President Obama say that that's racist to do so, and so they're letting those crowds hang out, and it's out of those crowds often that drive-by shootings emerge.
Okay, so they're not doing the kind of broken windows, preemptive kind of policing and patrolling that has worked so well, for example, in cities like New York. But here's the question that puzzles me. If this violence is going on in these neighborhoods as it is, and now we've had these headlines about Chicago for a couple of years, okay, why isn't there a local outcry in these neighborhoods and elsewhere in the city that says, we've got to do something here? I know it's not the north side and the affluent neighborhoods where this is happening, but look, I mean, this violence is getting headlines all across the country. Why not a grassroots uprising against it?
There is, up to a point. You know, there's calls to bring in the National Guard. In 2012, when they had a similar outbreak, there was calls to reinstitute a more aggressive stop, question, and frisk regimen and bring in an anti-gang unit. But the fact of the matter is that the activists control the public discourse there. And they believe, one of their demands is to disband the Chicago Police Department entirely. And in a sense, we're sort of getting that informally. Now, again, the cops are working their hearts out on behalf of victims after the fact, but they're not engaged in what you call rightly the preemptive, proactive policing.
All right, so what role is Rahm Emanuel playing? I can't imagine that these kinds of statistics are helpful to him as a politician. What is he not saying anything? Is he saying it's somebody else's fault? What's he doing?
He's caught, and he's changed his tune. Last October, he met with Attorney General Loretta Lynch in Washington and himself acknowledged the depolicing effect, what I've called the Ferguson effect. He said cops had gone fetal. He noticed this. He said they're not interdicting criminal behavior. But then there was the final belated release of video of a very bad police shooting. And the political discourse has gotten even more anti-cop in Chicago, so he does not dare at this point stand up for proactive policing, and all he can do is complain about gun statutes and gun sentencing not being severe enough. That may be true. Of course, it's the Black Caucus that refuses to allow more extended sentences for repeat gun felons. But that's, in fact, not the problem, because the gun sentencing regime has not changed since 2014. What has changed is officers' willingness to engage in proactive policing. But at this point, Emanuel doesn't dare say it's time for the cops to go back being proactive.
All right, Heather McDonald, thanks very much for being here. Appreciate it.
On the Jersey Shore, there was a mysterious explosion Saturday morning before the start of a charity race benefiting U.S. sailors and Marines. The FBI is investigating. Dave Carlin of WCBS in New York is in Seaside Park, New Jersey with the latest. Dave.
Behind me is Ocean Avenue in Seaside Park, New Jersey, and right over there is where the device exploded. It was left in a garbage can along the route for a 5K run that benefits the U.S. Marine Corps. The blast came just as the event was about to kick off.
It literally sounded like somebody lit a firework, you know, the big aerial fireworks off on the beach.
No one was injured, probably thanks to the fact the run was delayed after a suspicious backpack was reported. That kept runners away from this area.
The timing was truly serendipitous that they had only done the 1 mile fun run, which turns around early, and they had not started the larger 5K.
The race is canceled, and everyone is urged to stay away from here while investigators search up and down the shoreline here, determining exactly what kind of device this was and searching for suspects.
A whole army of investigators are fanning out, examining the device, questioning individuals, looking for surveillance-type footage of the area.
Neighbors and investigators thinking about what might have been, considering themselves very lucky. For CBS News, Dave Carlin, Seaside Park, New Jersey.
Dave, thank you. Russia's military claims U.S.-led forces unleashed an airstrike Saturday that killed more than 60 Syrian troops. U.S. officials say a coalition airstrike targeting ISIS was immediately halted when officials learned Syrian troops may have been inadvertently targeted. The U.S. and Russia have been fighting on opposite sides of the war in Syria, but recently agreed to a ceasefire to allow desperately needed food and supplies into war-torn areas. Under that ceasefire, ISIS can still be targeted. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Palmer has breaking news from Syria's largest city, Aleppo.
There's news tonight on that United Nations aid convoy that's been stuck on the Turkish border for the past 4 days. A UN source tells us it's expected to move tomorrow into eastern Aleppo. The delay was caused by generals and diplomats trying to negotiate the convoy's safe passage along a highly contested stretch of road. The UN also blamed the Assad government for dragging its heels on the paperwork. If all goes well, 2 aid convoys carrying food for 80,000 people for a month will arrive in rebel-held Aleppo, which has been under intermittent siege by government forces all summer. We're now 5 days into the ceasefire, but ever since it went into effect on Monday evening, we've heard the intermittent sounds of artillery. As you might expect, both sides are accusing the other of breaching the truce, and the truth is impossible to determine. However, the overall levels of violence are sharply down, and most crucially, there have been no airstrikes on the rebel-held side of Aleppo by either Russian or Syrian planes. DeMarco?
All right, Liz Palmer in Aleppo. Liz, thank you.
Peace activist and former U.S. Marine Ken O'Keefe joins us from Dominica. Sir, welcome to the program. Talk to us about Russia's recent request from the U.S. asking them to separate the opposition groups from the terrorists and the Nusra Front and Daesh.
Well, it's hard to understand why Russia or any other government would even begin to trust the United States as an honest broker in truly fighting terrorism. The war on terror itself is based on a false pretext that 19 Muslim hijackers are responsible for the events of 9/11. We know this is patently false. The evidence clearly shows that Israeli Mossad was directly involved in the bringing down of the Twin Towers and presumably Building 7. We know that Israeli fingerprints are all over it. We know that traitors in the U.S. government were involved in a plan to carry out an agenda of global spectrum dominance, full spectrum dominance, and all of this has been hand in hand with the pawns in the game of Al-Qaeda, today Al-Nusra Front, ISIS. These are nothing but stooges who were paid for, mercenaries, and are paid for by our proxies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others. And all of these proxy elements, mercenary forces, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whatever they want to call them, are the justification to continue carrying on the farcical war on terror, which itself is based on a lie. So the idea that the United States government or its partners in the West actually want to fight terrorism is beyond ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense, and nobody who's clearly observing what is happening in our world would be able to see it that way. The truth of the matter is that the policies in the Middle East are a direct result of an agenda which has nothing to do with fighting terrorism. To the contrary, it's all about sowing the seeds of sectarian hatred and fostering terrorism. I continue to refer to Oded Yanan's strategy for Israel in the 1980s. If you have not read that document, you need to read the document, because the policy of the Middle East right now is perfectly in line with Oded Yanan's strategy for Israel in the 1980s. And the bigger, broader plan is to break up the surrounding nations by sowing the seeds of sectarian hatred, i.e. using your money to feed these psychopaths who are running around Syria, Libya, and in the region in general, in Iraq, obviously, and ultimately to fracture and weaken the surrounding countries, to get the Arabs to, quote, bleed each other. And in this weakened, fractured state, Israel will then eventually be able to use any type of provocation, a false flag, to justify expanding into the surrounding countries, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt. This is the plan, and it's being played out to a T. And the fact that Israel has never once been attacked by Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, or ISIS, and the fact that Israel has provided medical support to Al-Nusra Front in the Golan Heights, with Bibi Netanyahu himself being pictured with these militants, tells you everything about the relationship between the United States and its best friend Israel and the so-called terrorists in the Middle East. These are our paid mercenaries through our proxies, so the idea that the U.S. is fighting this is absurd on its face.
Thank you very much, sir. Peace activist and former U.S. Marine Ken O'Keefe joining us here on Press TV's Top 5.
This is AP News Minute. A rambling note expressing hatred for police was found after a man went on a shooting spree in Philadelphia overnight, killing a woman, injuring 2 police officers, and wounding 3 others. The man was shot and killed by police. A pipe bomb exploded in Seaside Park, New Jersey, shortly before the start of a 5K charity race to benefit Marines and sailors. No injuries were reported, but the race was canceled. Donald Trump campaigned in Houston Saturday, telling an anti-immigration group that open borders are costing U.S. lives. Meanwhile, former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who served under President Obama, and former President George W. Bush wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal describing Trump as, quote, beyond repair when it comes to national security. Traditional bands and beer wagons took to the streets of Munich, Germany, as the city kicked off its annual Oktoberfest. The beer will be flowing until October 3rd. Ned Barker, The Associated Press, with AP News Minute.
And joining us out of Australia for more on the story is Mrs. Mimi Al-Laham, Syrian activist and political commentator. Hi, Mimi. Nice to have you back on the Press TV again. Now, Mimi, the U.S. involvement seems to only further complicate things on the ground, as we have the FSA, which is both U.S. and Turkey-backed. You have the Kurds, which are U.S.-backed and targeted by Turkey. You have the Kurds and the FSA, which don't get along with one another. Can you help us understand this seemingly complicated scenario?
Yeah, I think the Americans are trying to juggle several different interests at the same time. They have to contend with Turkey and the Syrian rebels, and at the same time, they have their agenda of creating a Zionist Kurdish state. And I say Zionist Kurdish state because the state that they envisage is going to be a pro-Israeli state, vassal state, that is one of the projects of the 1982 Israeli Union plan. So they have to juggle their NATO ally Turkey, which is of course opposed to this, as well as the Syrian rebels, which are naturally opposed to having a piece of their country divided, and at the same time support the Kurds. And it's not working out for them, obviously. They have completely lost support in most parts of Syria. The only support now that they could muster are from some Kurdish elements. And a lot of the Kurds that are actually fighting alongside them aren't necessarily Syrian Kurds. They can be Turkish and Iraqi Peshmerga. So really they have no support inside Syria, which is demonstrated by this video. The other thing that's demonstrated by the video is that all along the US has been backing people that, you know, may not be what the Americans would call, you know, something that they have interest in. In fact, a lot of these groups have been fighting alongside Al-Qaeda. And the rhetoric displayed in this video sort of, you know, goes alongside with that fact.
I mean, Mimi, the most important objective of the so-called U.S.-led coalition was supposedly to go after terrorism. I mean, what happened? I mean, it seems like we have all these twisted objectives where Daesh seems to be dropping down a few lines on that list of priorities. What happened to first eradicating terrorism and then dealing with these political objectives that the U.S. or Turkey may have?
You know, absolutely. The fact that it's confusing is because the Americans are speaking with forked tongues. And basically we must ignore everything that they're saying because they've been the #1 sponsors of terrorism, and I'm speaking about, of course, the U.S. administration. Since the 80s, they created Al-Qaeda, they brought Al-Qaeda to Iraq, they, of course, brought Al-Qaeda and ISIS to Syria, and are now openly backing it. So it just, the way to understand the situation is, in fact, to read the documents that are coming out of their think tanks. And all along, the project has always been for a new Middle East, which involves carving up the countries under sectarian lines and instilling sectarian hatred in the Middle East. That's always been the stated project of the U.S. State Department. And if we look at things in that perspective, supporting one side and the other side and having them fight each other, that's perfectly reasonable under the U.S. objective.
And then you have Turkey. Ankara says its objective is to go after Daesh terrorists and Kurdish militants. But then when Daesh was right there in Kobani at a rock's throw from a Turkish border, they watched them massacre citizens in Kobani without even raising an eyebrow. But the second that there are Kurds in Jarablus, all of a sudden Turkey makes this incursion into Syria. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the Turkish interests, in this scenario is, of course, to attack the Kurds and prevent any creation of a Kurdish state. Not so much to attack ISIS, that's just an excuse. In fact, attacking ISIS is an excuse for the Americans as well, whose main objective is to create a Kurdish state. So ISIS is really just a pawn. It's not really the main objective here, which is the Kurdish state.
A lot of people say pardon, I didn't mean to cut you off, but a lot of people say for Ankara, there's two objectives that come before going after Daesh. One is to overthrow Damascus, Syrian government, and the other is to go after Kurds, and they both are priorities for Ankara that come before going after terrorists.
I don't think Ankara has any objective to go after terrorists at all. I mean, I think that the only objectives that they have is the first two that you stated, preventing a Kurdish state, which, is not necessarily a bad thing. And actually, it's a good thing, but also to overthrow the Syrian government. And unfortunately, those two things at the same time, it's almost impossible for that to happen. If you destabilize Syria, Syria might get divided by the United States. So Turkey has, since the beginning of the war, been, in fact, working against its own interests by supporting terrorists in Syria in order to destabilize it. So I would say that the Turkish objective to fight terrorism is just a cover for the first two objectives, and violating Syrian sovereignty in that way and creating their buffer zone to allow the rebels to take the area.
Thank you, Mimi, for your input. That's Mimi Allaham joining us out of Australia, Syrian activist and political commentator.